The torch slipped from a gloved hand and clattered against the stone. Someone cursed, and a ring of voices tightened like a net. The occult researcher moved through the doorway without announcing himself because there was no time for ceremony. Suspicion drove him forward. A single line of testimony had named this chamber and a phrase that he could not ignore, and his suspicion pulled him down the stairs. He found hooded figures in a low room, candles arranged in uneven concentric circles, and on a blood-smeared lectern a torn page that bluntly declared humans an error. The initial confrontation came in the same breath. "Who are you?" a voice demanded, and a woman in a hood stepped into the light with her hand on a dagger. He kept his hands where she could see them. The researcher had seen cult rooms before. He had catalogued sigils and recorded liturgies. He was not unprepared, but the word on that page narrowed his options and intensified his movements. Suspicion shifted into caution as Mara, the woman with the dagger, seized his arm and searched him for papers. "Why are you here, researcher?" she said. The question was a demand and a threat. He met her gaze, noted the dry scar along her jaw, and said, "To read the codex. To understand what you call a sacrament." His voice was measured and low. Mara did not relax, her fingers tightened. They led him into an antechamber while the congregation resumed its ritual outside. The researcher kept watching hands and feet, cataloguing exits, listening for guards. The lieutenant who met them, Hierophant Elian, stood with a ledger in one hand and a comb that looked like planning. Elian's face was composed. He read the researcher's identity aloud as if reading a line in a ledger. "You pry where you must not." "Elian, explain." The researcher said only, "I saw a fragment. The page names humanity, a mistake. I need to know what comes next." Elian flipped the ledger to a blank page and held the torn scrap up. The fragment showed a ritual rubric and words that meant Eresha. The researcher's suspicion slid into alarm when Elian plainly, "We have a timetable. A public sacrament is scheduled in the lower quarter." The claim made the threat immediate. The researcher now had to act on evidence rather than inference. He escaped by moving like a man who had rehearsed his exit. He feigned compliance, then stepped backward when a door opened, elbowed past a distracted acolyte, and dropped into the alley while a rain of cold water hit the flagstones. He did not run blindly. He ran with a purpose. To the university archive, where archivist Lena kept late hours and kept her temper short and her locks tighter. The researcher arrived with his coat damp and his palms scraped. He carried the torn scrap wrapped in oilskin. Suspicion had become a pressure on his chest that made his fingers clench. He handed the page to Lena without preamble. Lena took the scrap and set it under a lamp. "You smell of incense and wet stone," she said, turning the paper to the light. Her voice held practical worry, not shock. "Where exactly did you find this?" The researcher told her. "Stairwell beneath the tannery, a house with tavern above, a concealed door through a kiln room." He spoke quickly and used short sentences. Lena counted ledger entries aloud as she worked, and then she said, "If they schedule a sacrament in a quarter, they intend more than symbolism. They intend an act done before witnesses." Her words tilted the conversation toward urgency. A man burst into the archive backroom 30 minutes later, carrying his coat and his terror. Thomas' hands shook so badly that he left salt stains on the sill of the window. He had been a courier inside the cult's network, and he had fled hours ago. They changed the timetable. Thomas without preamble, Elian moved it forward. "The sacrament will be in 3 nights in the lower market. I brought this." He dropped a folded piece of paper on the table. Lena opened it and her eyes went hard as flint. The timetable listed streets, a list of attendants, and a phrase that matched the torn rubric. "Ceremonial erasure." The researcher read the names and felt the urgency spike into a second emotion. Dread. The dread tightened his jaw and forced his hands to tremble when he set the page down. They decided to act. The researcher, Lena, and Thomas planned an infiltration to steal the full codex from a mid-level gathering. The plan required timing and routes. The researcher rehearsed the motions aloud, climbed the service stairs, slipped past a sleeping guard behind the tavern, enter the meeting house from the eaves. Lena checked ink blotters that Thomas had taken, then sealed the codex, likely storage in a list of probable locations. Thomas volunteered to guide them. He spoke in short bursts. Left at the brewer's, through the cartway, a cellar door with rusted hinges, the three left before midnight. The meeting house smelled of old ale and new wax. The researcher moved with his shoulders low, Lena trailing with a satchel of tools. Thomas led, whispering directions. They reached a side door. The researcher lifted the latch, it yielded. Inside, a circle of masked initiates sat on benches. A clay idol rested on the table, cracked and smeared with ash. The room had a mid-level guard who looked up and murmured, more curious than alarmed. The researcher reached for the codex where it lay under the idol's broken foot. He felt wood grain and soot beneath his fingers and the leather cool to the touch. He slid the codex toward his sleeve. Then a weight landed on the hand of Thomas from behind, and a rope tightened around his ankle. A voice hissed his name. Thomas faltered. His mouth opened and then closed. He whispered, "They promised me safety." There was a pause of 3 quick movements. A man at the doorway slammed a cane against the floor, boots thundered, and the room snapped to attention. Thomas turned and said, "Aye," but his sentence faded into a sudden silence of accusation. He had been seen. The researcher lunged. Lena pushed a bench to block the doorway. Mara stepped forward with a blade. The researcher felt betrayal crack like the clay idol. A rapid exchange followed.
"Thomas!"
The researcher said, "What have you done?" "I did what I had to," Thomas replied. "I never meant to." Mara cut him off. "You lied to us." "You lie to all of us." The argument was short, jagged lines, 3 to 5 beats of accusation and denial. Thomas's face showed a mix of fear and defeat. The researcher reached for Thomas's wrist and found it empty of the timetable. A guard struck at the researcher. He moved backward and the codex fell to the floor with a sound like a small fist hitting wood. A scuffle spun the small room into violence. The researcher was pinned by 2 men and dragged through a service corridor into a deeper part of the building. Elian stood in a low vaulted hall when they brought the researcher before him. He did not shout. He took the codex in both hands and opened it as if testing paper weight. The researcher asked for a chance to explain, and his voice was steady. Elian put the codex down and read a passage aloud with laconic clarity. A sacrament bound to an action that would publicly mark people, and then erase them ceremonially. We do not begin without measure, Elian. The researcher heard both a defense and a threat. He who decides who is erased. Elian smiled the kind of smile that rearranged meanings. What is wrong is obvious, Elian replied. Our charge is to correct what was made by mistake. The researcher felt shame and anger cycle through him. Shame that he had failed to prevent earlier abuses, anger at the explicit call to violence. They did not kill him where they stood. Elian offered a bargain. If the researcher would leave and publish nothing, his life would be spared. The researcher looked at the cracked clay idol beneath a low lantern. He weighed choices in the space of heartbeats. He refused. Elian's hand met the ledger and marked the decision. The researcher escaped again, not by cunning but through a narrow distraction. Lena had set a small flare in the archives earlier. Smoke spilled into the corridors and guards diverted to the blaze. The researcher broke a window and dropped into the alley, clutching the codex in a sack. He found Lena waiting with Thomas at the appointed spot. Thomas's face was bloodless and his eyes avoided contact. They returned to the hidden archive where Lena forced the codex onto a table and began translating. The leather of the codex smelled of tar and animal glue. Pages stuck together and ink had blood where water had fallen. Lena read aloud and the researcher listened with a mix of scientific distance and a new anger that made his jaw ache. The codex described rites that balanced theological argument with precise acts, offerings, names to be spoken, and a formula that pointed to public performance. The researcher read a passage that listed neighborhood bells to be rung and an assembly to be gathered. He stopped reading aloud when Lena clenched the edge of the table and said, "They intend the square with the market stalls. They will make a spectacle." Her voice shook, but her actions did not. Thomas revealed that he had been contacted by a handler that day. The handler threatened his sister. The researcher pressed for details. "Thomas, they used her name and the place she works. If I double-cross, they will come for her at dawn." That confession was a new pivot. Betrayal had consequences that reached into family, and the researcher's anger shifted into a pragmatic coldness. He demanded a plan that protected the sister and prevented the sacrament. Lena checked safe houses while Thomas sat with his head in his hands and muttered the rut of the market. They planned a midnight infiltration that was supposed to be precise and small. The researcher insisted on taking the codex to show authorities. Lena objected. Any official inquiry would be blocked or corrupted. They argued and reached a compromise. Expose a controlled fragment to trusted magistrates while disrupting the ritual in person. On the night of the sacrament, the lower market smelled of wet straw and smoke from cooking fires. The researcher, Lena, and two allies concealed themselves behind a stack of crates near the central arch. The crowd gathered with a mixture of curiosity and routine. The cult had built a history of public pageantry to draw crowds. Elian arrived with robed attendants and a clay effigy in a covered basket. The researcher watched hands and watched the altar. He felt a small, hard clarity. If he intervened too soon, the cult would label him as rabble-rouser. If he waited too long, those marked by the ritual would pay with blood. His emotions shifted from dread to a sharpened resolve. He tapped Lena twice. She nodded and moved with him. They chose their moment when Elian lifted the basket. He began the rubric and names were spoken. The congregation leaned forward and offered coins. Mara scanned the crowd and locked eyes with the researcher for a beat. He stepped from the crates and shouted, "Stop!" The single word tore through the murmur. Elian did not flinch. Mara advanced with a blade. The researcher reached into his coat and produced the torn scrap, holding it up so the crowd could see the phrase that called people a mistake. He read a line from the codex aloud and the crowd craned. A woman near the front turned pale and stepped backward. Violence erupted. Mara lunged and the researcher grabbed her wrist. Her blade nicked his palm. In the struggle, a basket overturned and the clay idol struck the stones with a crack. Someone in the crowd shouted for guards. The researcher saw Elian lift his hand as if blessing the disruption, and then, with a single motion, the congregation moved to silence the interference. The researcher fought. Lena struck a man who tried to pull him down. Thomas ran from a side lane and pushed through the crowd to the arch, yelling his sister's name. The structure of the ritual collapsed into chaotic shoving. In the chaos, the codex snagged on a merchant's peg and tore further. A page tore away and fluttered into mud. The researcher felt a sharp, physical loss like a cut to the forearm. They escaped in the confusion, but not cleanly. A cart blocked the street and Lena was thrown against a post. She hit her ribs and coughed blood into a handkerchief. Thomas' eyes had a hard new edge. He had walked into the crowd to pull a child from the quarrel, and in doing so revealed himself to a handler who was not far away. The researcher grabbed Lena and pulled her through a broken gate, while Thomas slipped to the rear to distract potential pursuers. They fled across rain, slick cobbles as bells began to toll for morning. The codex was bruised and partly destroyed. A large section of ritual instruction was charred. The researcher tasted smoke and copper. He had stopped the public sacrament on that street, but the screw had not been fully turned. Back in the dim study that overlooked the city, the researcher laid out the surviving fragments and catalogued them. He felt exhaustion run through his limbs like lead, and a new determination take root in his posture. The emotional cycle had run, suspicion to dread, dread to resolve, then resolve to wary vigilance. He and Lena numbered pages, transcribed names, and argued the sequence of events aloud. They decided the best course was to expose what remained in a controlled release that magistrates could not easily dismiss as rumor. He wrapped the most damning fragments in oilcloth and placed them inside an envelope. Before he sealed the envelope, Thomas returned with a small, shivering figure at his back, his sister. She had been watched but not harmed. Thomas stood by the window and said, "They came tonight to take her if I failed." They left a mark on the tavern door to show they could. He drew a finger across the wood and revealed a stamped sigil. The researcher examined it slowly and then locked eyes with Thomas. "You should have told us earlier," he said. Thomas answered with a short, broken sentence. "I wanted to protect her." The exchange was brief and raw. Lena stepped forward and checked the woman's pulse, the way a caretaker does when danger has passed but fear remains. They tabulated losses. The codex was damaged. Several pages were missing. Mara had disappeared in the crowd and was not accounted for. A line remained unexposed in the city, and the timetable suggested cells elsewhere. Yet they had names, dates, and a public incident to point to. The researcher made a choice he could not rescind. He would publish the fragments to a guild of independent chroniclers and present the physical evidence at a magistrate's hearing. Lena argued they should first verify every name. We give them facts to hold on to. They will either act or be exposed for inaction." His voice was flat and steady. The chapter closed on a concrete act. The researcher placed the envelope with the surviving fragments into a locked bureau drawer. He set the lamp lower and noted the city beyond the study window, where a church bell tolled and a stray cart moved past. He felt the ache of loss in his ribs and the weight of decision in his hands. He wrote a single line of instruction for Lena. "Take 2 copies of the transcriptions to the chroniclers at first light." Then there was a knock at the door. He looked up, reached for his coat, and told Lena, "Answer it." The knock repeated, measured and deliberate. The chapter ends with the researcher closing the drawer on the codex and stepping toward the door, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor matching the knock outside. A courier slammed into the channel, side alley, and shoved a scorched parchment into the occult researcher's palm. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He stepped aside to block the path and saw 3 masked shapes slide past the market gate. "Take it," the courier gasped, blood on his knuckles. "They'll come for this." The courier's breath smelled of wet ash. He crumpled to his knees and pushed the paper toward the researcher before losing consciousness. The alley stank of fish and old coal. The researcher did not hesitate. He tightened his fingers around the parchment, and held the ash, stiff edge up to the lamplight. Suspicion had been his first response and became a method. Check the document, check the route, check what someone was willing to risk bleeding for. He moved before he named the danger aloud, because a delay would let the masked figures close that gap. He kept his movements precise. He drew a single breath, slid the grimoire under his arm, and backed toward the side exit he used when merchants slept. He had no cloak on this patrol, only the tailored coat with subtle embroidery over dark wool, and the brass compass rested cold in his pocket. He did not call Alina. He could not risk voice in a narrow place where the market's lanterns made long knives of light. Within 5 minutes, the safe house accepted him without question. Brother Matthias met him at the stair with one hand on a candlestick and the other on a wound that had not yet healed. "You have it." "Matthias." His voice was a rasp. It did not try to hide the tremor beneath. The researcher set the parchment on the table and flattened it with a careful palm. Alina stood at the window with a stack of vellum and a lamp. She had ironed her hair back into a tight coil and pushed a margin of black away from her forehead. "Read it aloud," she said. "We record everything." Her tone made recording into a ritual. Her fingers tapped the ledger by habit. The parchment had been burned along one edge. A ring of soot marked several words. The visible ink listed 3 names, a date, and a crude diagram. A circle crossed by 3 spokes, and a small triangular notch. Someone had pressed ash into the loop where the 3rd name should be. The researcher traced the ink with a fingertip, and a memory returned precisely. The torch slipped from a gloved hand and clattered against the stone in the old records room. Someone had cursed, and a ring of voices tightened like a net. He kept that image tight, not as reflection but as a fact he could use. "Elena," he said, "tell me what you see." He did not ask for a translation. He for what could be acted upon. Elena read, short, clipped, name 1, Lissa Farrow, name 2, Mayor Corin Hale, 3rd, erased. Date, solstice 3rd night, diagram. Ritual device schematic shortened for unbinding. She stopped, fingers on the parchment. This is not academic. This is a plan. Her voice narrowed from scholar's clarity into something like urgency. Brother Matthias leaned closer and hummed a single low syllable. "They designed a machine," he said, "not a machine you think of, but an apparatus, wood, wax, copper, calibrated to perform the gesture the codex described. If Lissa Farrow is on that list, they picked the wrong set of people." His eyes did not leave the ink. The researcher felt suspicion shift into alarm. He stood and paced to the map pinned above the hearth. The solstice was 3 nights away. The ledger's circuit indicated a public square. "We cannot wait until the festival," he said. "We must find where they rehearse and who put Lissa on that list." He did not mention the mayor aloud, but Elena's fingers tightened on the table. They moved to decode methodically. Elena pulled the fragment under a loop and traced an underlayer of ink that had been mixed with resin. Matthias produced a scraped coin and used its edge to lift particles of ash into a bowl. The researcher kept watch at the window. Outside, the market's shutters clanked and the river, visible between warehouses, sounded like a low metal hum. "Listen, Elena." She tapped the diagram, the spokes aligned to time markers. "This is a rehearsal timetable, not just symbolism. They practiced stages at different moons. If the fragment names a solstice, they intend to synchronize tools across the square." She looked up. "They plan public action, not private penance. People will be chosen on a list. They will test the apparatus first, perhaps with a smaller device." Her jaw set. "They test to prove it works." Her voice had no flourish, only exact weights. "Matthias, I know a man who recruits, Cashin. He runs a tea house off the market." He kept his hands folded as if to keep them from shaking. "He'll no rehearsal sites. He hates what this has become, but he answers for coin and for fear. He may trade a location for a promise." He set his terms plainly. They planned a bait. The researcher and Elena would go to the tea house at dusk and let Matthias set the conversation. They needed Cashin's street knowledge and his slippery honesty. The researcher felt suspicion tilt toward a different posture. Doubt about how deep the malice went. Doubt is a hard edge, it makes testable questions. He set the ledger into the grimoire and wrapped it in oilskin. Dusk found the tea house crowded with merchant voices and tea steam. Cassin sat with his chin on his hand, eyes like small cinders. The researcher and Elena took a table at the back with broad backs to the room. Cassian, Matthias, sliding into the seat across. He used the recruiter's name as an opening wedge. Cashin's voice was low. "Matthias, you relate to lie to me. The new sort of recruits don tea like my table." He smiled, not warm, but practiced. "What do you want?" he asked. "A rehearsal site, Matthias, for masked initiates." "Where do they practice?" He kept his question direct. Cassian's smile tightened. "You're not the only one who hears the drums," he said. "They use the square because it's public and it looks like prayer. They like the crowd, it blurs responsibility. If you must know, they rehearse near the Eastern Arcade at night. Someone with influence brings props through the cloister. I saw a cleric once, hands clean as a child's." He spat the word cleric as if it tasted wrong. Elena leaned in. "A cleric. Name." Her voice was a scalpel. Cashin shrugged. "A man tired of secrets. Not a name I would shout. A cloaked observer. Solid gold thread on the robe." He watched the props and left coins each night. He tapped his temple. "Power pays for rehearsal rooms. Power hides what it tends." If you take my lead, you do it with caution." He slid a folded scrap across the table. There was a ledger. Not mine. I glimpsed binding and names. It frightened me. I left it there. He did not meet their eyes. They left the tea house with a new direction and little else. On the walk back, the researcher catalogued the possibilities. A cleric with gold thread, a public rehearsal, a list of names. Suspicion swelled into focused purpose. He found that his hands, usually steady, had begun to tremble with redness. Under a thin pre-dawn haze at the square, they waited behind shuttered market stalls. The researcher had Alina hand him a small spyglass. The masked initiates appeared in a braided line, props under wrapped cloth. A cloaked figure watched from a columned walkway, his sleeve traced with gold. The researcher felt his certainty fracture into something colder. Complicity. The presence of that cleric changed the scale of danger. Matthias tried to move closer and was seen. Two guard-like figures seized him in a tight cuff.
"Matthias!"
Elena hissed. The researcher sprang forward and pushed between crates, aiming to distract the guards. He moved with measured violence, shove, elbow, a thrown fist that struck a jaw with a thud. A guard hit him with a heavy boot. He tasted metal. He saw Matthias dragged toward a shadowed doorway. The capture forced a decision. The researcher weighed rescue against exposure. He barked,
"Cashin, now!"
into a pocket-coded phrase. Casson, waiting in the lane with a covered cart, cursed under his breath and stepped into the square with a false stumble that scattered crates. Men who watched the street turned their heads. The distraction gave Alina time to slip a small blade from her boot and cut the bonds on Matthias' wrists. She worked with hands that shook, but did not stop. They fled through a side entrance beneath the arcade and into the vaults under the square. Their boots echoed on wet stone. Cashin closed the trapdoor behind them. The place reeked of old incense. The vaults smelled like the underside of the city, damp, copper, and older oil. Inside, they found a ledger. It sat on an oaken table, bound with leather and knotted cord. On the cover, someone had pressed a sigil in wax. The researcher unlaced the cord. He understood at once that this ledger was the bureaucratic heart of the sect. Lists, targets, provisions for props and apparatus, payments recorded to names he could recognize, a council scribe, a supplier of copper, a minor magistrate. Cashin took a step back. "They list names by neighborhoods," he said. "This is worse than I thought. Lisa Farros's name is here. So is a child's. They pick not for sin, but for symbolic placement." He swallowed. "If they unmake someone in the square, they unmake a social knot. People will panic." His voice dropped. Alina ran her finger along a column of ink, an apparatus described as unbinding by mimicry. They planned to imitate the Codex's formula in physical terms. Wood, copper, wax, and a measured strike. They think they can perform erasure with a machine. She looked at the researcher. "This ledger proves coordination, payments, and a rehearsal schedule. It's not doctrine bootstrapped, it's logistics," she breathed out. They heard a footstep above. A shadow passed the trapdoor slight. Cashin whispered, "Someone's watching us from the square S floor. The cloaked observer may be inside the council tonight." He pressed a palm flat to the page. "If we leave with this ledger, we are marked." The moment narrowed. They planned the extraction of Matthias and the ledger. The researcher formed a quick list. Alina would keep the ledger wrapped in oilskin. Cashin would carry a cart as cover. The researcher and Matthias would leave by the water gate. The plan required one more risk. The high initiate often inspected the vaults at dawn. If he arrived, they would be exposed. The researcher felt resolve harden into readiness. At dawn, they descended the corridor toward the fractured demiurge statue that formed the ritual heart beneath the square. Candles had been lit and left to gutter. Someone had arranged shards on a raised plinth. The high initiate stood with masked acolytes in a slow ring. He spoke without raising his voice. "Erasure is mercy. The world is wrong, and we repair it by removing what does not belong." His tone was flat and deliberate. He addressed the room as if reciting a ledger entry. The researcher stepped forward with Elena and Cashin at his flank. "You will not take Matthias," he said. He put the ledger on the plinth between them and the initiate. He did not shout. He pushed the book toward the blade of attention in the room. "You keep lists. You call yourself repairers. This ledger names innocence. We will expose you." His voice was a tool, blunt and precise. The high initiate smiled like someone admitting an obvious fact. "Exposure will not change a design," he said. "You value lives because you were made to. We value order because we were called to correct an error." He flicked a shard of glass with a finger, and the shard caught candlelight like a small confession. "You misunderstand the necessity. Erasure restores scale, it returns debt to its owner. We are mercy in motion. We are law." The calm in his voice unsettled the researcher more than any shout could. Words became action. An initiate lunged for the ledger. Elena shoved the book backward, and a shard of the fractured statue cut her palm. She hissed but did not drop the ledger. Matthias fought a guard by the column. Boots and hands collided with bone. Cassin cried out when someone grabbed his arm and tore his coat. The room narrowed to fists and the scrape of leather on stone. During the struggle, the high initiate moved close and whispered, "You see the ledger and think you own truth. You keep your book and your ministrations, but the law is not a page. Choose now. Burn this book and go, or stay and be unmade." He extended an open palm where a small brass token sat. The token had the same sigil as the wax on the ledger. The researcher heard the exactness in the man's voice and felt a permanent motion in his chest. The desire to save one life at the price of keeping knowledge. A decision pressed against him. He could destroy the ledger and spare the immediate lives in the square, but that would let the design continue elsewhere. He could fight to seize and take the ledger, but then he risked Matthias and Elena. The researcher made a calculation in bone and breath. He grabbed the ledger, shoved it into his oilskin wrap, and slammed the book under his coat. He lunged toward the nearest acolyte with a measured shove that sent the man into a candle. The sound of fabric catching fire was immediate and precise. Elena pushed past him and pulled Matthias free in a tight move that left a scrape across her wrist. Cassian kicked a brazier and rolled smoke into the room. The high initiate barked and several masked figures converged. The researcher took a step back and felt a blade nick his sleeve. He did not find the edge of triumph. He found only the arithmetic of loss. Elena bleeding, Matthias limping, Cashin coughing from smoke. They fought through a corridor of thrown steps and flaring lamps. The high initiate's voice chased them. "You will fail to stop what must be corrected." The researcher did not answer with words. He pulled a hidden latch and let them slip into the wet quay where a basket boat waited. A hand from above grabbed the hem of his coat, and he twisted free, clutching the ledger under wet cloth. The water lapped at the boat's gunwale. They shoved off and floated into the grey morning that smelled of tar and riverweed. On the quay, the researcher unwrapped the ledger and held it with a hand that trembled but did not drop it. Pages fluttered with smoked edges, lists in neat ink, signatures and a pressed coin. Elena leaned her head against a crate and tasted iron. Matthias leaned over the edge and breathed, as if new air had weight. Cashin sat and rubbed at his forehead with slow fingers. The ledger proved the scale of the conspiracy. Payments into church coffers, directions to minor magistrates, a patron in the eastern cloister who signed with a mark that matched coin, lists found in municipal accounting. They had obstructed themselves from the obvious. The network ran through official ledgers, through gold, threaded robes, through men who liked order more than mercy. Matthias spoke first. "We stopped one right," he said. "We did not stop the ledger." He did not sound small. He sounded factual. "They will move the target. They will choose someone else. They think they are correcting a mistake. They will keep choosing." He spat the words out and rubbed the wound on his wrist. Elena closed her eyes for a second and then opened them. "Then we take the ledger where it will hurt them," she said. We show it at the magistrate's office, in the market, in the town square itself. We put their books next to ours. Power hides by keeping paperwork tidy. We will make the paper dirty. Her voice steadied into planning. They argued quietly about exposure risk and who would carry the ledger through public paths. Cashin, if we present this to the magistrate, remember you name a patron. You make an enemy who knows your faces. He looked at the researcher. You will be hunted. I will be too. You should think on what you will give up to prove this. His voice was blunt and practical. Their choices tightened into a plan. They would not burn the ledger. They would not hand it over to a single trusted office. They would divide copies and seed them across channels. The market scribe, an independent chronicler, and a provincial cleric known for independence. The researcher wrapped the ledger again and pushed his sleeve over the oilskin. He kept his fingers flat on the cover as if to reassure himself that the book existed and that a choice had been made. They left the quay at noon under a pale sky. The square was already filling with late shoppers. The researcher walked with measured gait and a small, almost invisible limp. Elena moved with the leather of a woman who had decided not to let blood slow her. Matthias walked between them, sometimes still clutching his wrist, sometimes looking at the river's slow edge. A single external event broke the careful cadence. A bell from the eastern cloister struck midday and, at the same moment, a finch startled from a stall awning and hit the merchant's sign. The researcher caught his reflection in a polished basin and did not like the man who looked back. He did not speak confession. He catalogued the facts. The ledger, the cleric, the list of names. They found a slow ferry to cross to the governor's quarter, and they took seats where no one would watch close. The researcher placed the ledger on his knee and closed his hand over it. He felt the burn of Elena's cut on his palm when he adjusted the coat. He felt Matthias breathe out a simple, repeated breath. As they drifted away from the island, the researcher realized the emotion that had started him. Suspicion had shifted twice. To alarm when the names named individuals, then to resolve when they stole the ledger. He felt another, quieter change beneath those movements. Clarity. The ledger turned the abstract doctrine into logistics. Now the problem was tangible and the solution required public action. He would no longer only study forbidden texts. He would carry one into the open. They stepped from the ferry onto the governor's quay. The researcher kept the ledger pressed to his chest. He heard the gulls and the distant toll of a bell. A boatman lowered a rope and called a price. The researcher paid without looking at his coins. He walked up the quay with the others in a line that resembled a small procession. Behind them, a cloaked figure watched from a column, gold thread catching the sun. The researcher did not look back. He folded his hand over the ledger and felt the cool leather beneath his palm. When the group reached the governor's gate, a young clerk stopped them. He for papers. The researcher handed his sealing ring and a forged duty slip. The clerk examined them and pushed the gate open with a bored thumb. The researcher led them through a courtyard to a low office where an independent chronicler would meet them. The chronicler's lamp burned low. The researcher set the ledger on the table and looked at Elena and Matthias. "Do not let the ledger leave this room without copies," he said. He spoke the instruction the way one closes a door. Elena reached for the edge and, with 2 fingers, opened the ledger so the chronicler could see the entries. The chronicler blinked, then said, "If this is true, you have made them enemies of very practical men. They will not be satisfied with words. They will find your door." He took up a pen. Outside, someone struck the long bell of the eastern cloister a second time. The researcher heard the sound as a measure. He folded his fingers over the ledger again and felt a presence at the threshold, a footfall. He turned his head. A shadow paused in the doorway, and a single gloved hand rested on the jamb. The chapter closed on that concrete beat. A glove on the jamb and the quiet certainty that the ledger had changed everything. Emotion root. Suspicion emotion shifts. Suspicion, alarm, doubt, resolve, clarity. The suspicion focused purpose, urgency, sacrifice, cautious, hope. The sea wind tore at the researcher's coat the moment he stepped onto the ruin. Suspicion sat like a stone behind his ribs. He had seen a courier arrive with blood and a parchment in Chapter 2, and that memory steeled his hands now. A masked voice chanted as figures hauled a fractured clay idol from a shallow pit. The courier, still breathing hard, pressed forward and shouted a single warning: "Stop the rite, erase their names, do not let them finish." The cliff amphitheater smelled of wet stone and smoke, and the researcher moved between the courier and the circle without hesitation. He kept his spectacles low. He kept his left hand on the worn leather grimoire at his hip. Concrete facts guided him. The courier had delivered a scorched parchment in an alley earlier. The smear of blood on the courier's knuckles matched the stain on one corner of that parchment. The researcher checked the sigil carved into the idol with the tip of his brass compass and did not speak. Mara stood at the ring's edge, one hand on the hem of her robe, breathing visible in the cold dusk air. The choir of initiates continued the litany. The masked council leader moved to a higher stone and raised a palm. "By the weight of our wrongs," the leader intoned, voice muffled by a fabric mask. "By the fracture of that first light, we require unmaking." The researcher stepped closer and said, "You cannot erase what you have not proved is an error." He kept his voice even and slow. He wanted to slow them as much as he wanted information. The leader's hand fell. "Who are you to interrupt?" a guard demanded. The researcher straightened. "I am a scholar. I carry witnesses." The guard laughed, low and rough. An initiate named Joran took 2 steps forward, and the courier collapsed to a knee, eyes rolling. The researcher reached for the courier's shoulder and felt heat and weakness under cloth. The first confrontation hardened. Mara's jaw moved. She mouthed a name and then looked away. "Mara," the researcher said, and her head snapped toward him. She did not meet his eyes. Her fingers trembled where they held her robe. The leader watched both of them. The tension kept time like a second hand. No one broke the rhythm. The courier forced a scorched parchment into the researcher's palm. He blinked at the burned edge and the smudged ink. He read aloud the clause that made every throat in the circle tighten. The rite would not kill flesh, but would excise collective memory, names, records, songs, until people could no longer call themselves human in any social record. "They plan to unwrite who we are," the researcher said. The phrase landed like a flat stone on water. Voices rose. "They will save the world from error," the leader said. "They will return us to before the mistake." Mara's breathing sped. The researcher watched her hands. He watched the courier's lips move. The man whispered a name that matched the researcher's memory of a ledger in Chapter 1. He had seen that ledger in the grimoire stub, a list of names crossed out in a hurried hand. The next events came in quick succession. Mara stepped toward the ring and seized the edge of the altar, fingers scraping ash. Other initiates grabbed her. "Mara, stop!" Joran cried. The researcher moved to pull at a bound wrist, but a masked hand clipped his sleeve. "Hands off the circle," the council leader said. The researcher felt the first true crack of the night's plan. Not everyone in the order believed with the same conviction. He bargained instead of striking. "Delay. 1 night. Let me verify this clause in situ. Let me speak to your council leader openly." The leader hesitated and then made a small, sharp sound. "We will not postpone what is ordained," the leader replied. "But tell me, scholar, name 1 witness who says you can stop what the demiurge demands." The researcher produced the burned ledger fragment and let the wind lift its edges so the leader could see the script. Joran stepped forward and touched the parchment as if testing its heat. "Act like Joran," he said to the circle, speaking his name carefully. "I found this in the archives beneath the Eastern Chapel. It lists the clauses for the erasure. It names the instruments required." His voice did not carry pride. It carried a report. The crowd buzzed. Someone hissed. Someone else began a low, mechanical chant. Mara lunged. She tried to pry the grimoire from the researcher's belt. He did not stop her with force. He let her fingers curl around the leather and close for a half-second before other initiates tackled her. She spat a single line. "You promised me safety." The leader's response was a thin laugh and a rope. "Safety is obedience, Mara. Obedience saves us from the mistake." The researcher saw the coil of reasoning. The council used promises to secure compliance. He turned to Joran. "Why did you bring this forward?" he asked. Joran's face was narrow behind a short beard. "Because I could not let them perform it without record," Joran replied. "I am not brave. I am tired of watching names vanish from ledgers without questions. I thought a scholar could make them answer." The researcher felt admiration and annoyance at once. This was not heroism, it was a practical choice to shift blame outward. The leader answered now with a story. He recited their origin myth in a flat scholar's chant. The words were not ornate, but they carried a legal tone. An architect of world who miscounted, a clay made demiurge who in its arrogance produced flawed beings. They are an error, the leader said. We are the correction. We will unwind this miscounting. The researcher's suspicion shifted to a different register. He felt the cold mathematics of ideology. This was not spiritual grief, it was a ledger-based logic. The bargain failed. The leader signaled and the initiates bent to the idol. The researcher saw the sigils traced around the base, and how the cracked clay had been filled with filings of iron and salt. He could hear the city's distant bells marking their hour, but the circle's rhythm stole attention. Mara watched with her mouth a straight line. The researcher touched his signet ring and felt the shallow engraving bite his palm. When the ritual began to accelerate, the courier screamed. He had been hiding a small cache beneath his leather, an amulet polished to shine. He flung it toward the center of the circle. The amulet hit the altar, skidded and struck the idol. Sparks flew. The initiates shouted. Someone in the outer ring flung a torch. Flames licked the robe of a masked initiate and a small fire popped in the dry ash. In the chaos, Mara moved. She reached for the idol. The researcher grabbed her wrist. Their hands collided over the cracked clay. He felt splinters of damp earth under his fingernails. Mara's face was mud-streaked, her eyes raw. "Break it," she said. "Break it now and let them answer for what they would erase." Her voice was a rasp. The leader barked in order. Acolyte Joran lunged to stop her. The researcher had one choice, to hold the line or to help her. They fought. Not dramatized heroics, fast, small motions. The researcher shoved Joran aside. Joran swore and swung. His palms struck the researcher's jaw. The researcher tasted iron. Mara countered by twisting her body under an arm and bringing her shoulder into the idol's rim. The idol cracked further along an old seam. The leader shouted, then moved toward them. A masked initiate struck Mara's face.
Blood met salt, Mara!
The researcher yelled. He pounded at the hands that held her. The leader reached for a ceremonial blade. The researcher tackled the leader's arm. The blade grazed his forearm. He smelled copper. He used his weight to tip the leader back onto uneven stone. The idol wavered, then split with a heavy sound like old ceramic collapsing. Dust and ash rose in a choking cloud. Everything changed in that collapse. The sigils flared and then failed. The sky answered with a crack of thunder. The initiates scattered like birds. Some fled down the cliff path, others stood, cuffing. A pair of coastal guards came racing from the south gate, drawn by the noise. One of them, recognizing the researcher from prior inquiries, raised a hand hold. He ordered. The ritual dissolved into arrests and running. The leader skirted the perimeter and, with a mask askew, spat an accusation. "You have undone necessity." Joran, pinned by his collar, hissed that he had not wanted blood. Mara crumpled to her knees and pressed a shaking palm to her face. The courier leaned against a low wall and trembled, repeating the same name from the parchment. The researcher moved through the mess to salvage what he could. He picked up a singed compendium where paper had not fully burned. Its edges were black but legible. He smelled resin and wet ink. He brushed ash from the cover and found the title cramped in a frantic hand. On the instruments of erasure, he slid it beneath his coat. Later, in a small, cold room lit by 3 candles and the offshore dawn, the researcher catalogued the fragments. Mara sat across the table with a rough blanket over her shoulders. She would not meet his eyes. "Why did you try to take the grimoire?" he asked. She chewed the inside of her cheek and did not answer at first. She folded her fingers and finally said, "I thought if I kept it, I could find a way out." The researcher nodded. Her answer revealed a second emotion, shame that had shifted from fear. They spoke in short sentences. "He, who forced you?" She named the council and then named a man he had seen earlier in archives, an urban magistrate who had granted the group legal shelter. He signed their permits. She said, "He wrote the seal that allowed them to access public records. Without that, they would not have found the ledgers." The researcher leaned forward and tapped the compendium's corner. "We have a trace then. Not only ritual, but legal facilitation." Another external hinge opened. Joran banged a fist on the table. "They tied people's names into accounts and then filed them away. They removed witness testimonies from district ledgers. They used the town's sax clerks to erase people who resisted their mandates." He spoke quickly and with a clipped anger that sounded almost like relief. "I stole one of the clerk's keys. I saw the tabs." The researcher listened and wrote a list of names in his own hand. This was not myth. It was bureaucracy. They argued about how to publish the compendium without putting Mara and Joran at risk. The researcher wanted a slow, methodical disclosure that would allow witnesses to file claims and for the magistrate seals to be checked. Joran wanted immediate testimony to the coastal guards. Mara wanted to run. The researcher watched their faces closely. He had to balance protection and revelation. He decided to record audio testimony first. "Mara," he said, "tell me exactly what you heard from the council leader when he explained the rite." She hesitated, then spoke in plain clauses. The researcher used a small recorder and kept his pauses minimal so the lines could be read easily for later transcripts. Her voice had stripped away any sermonizing. It contained facts and a small bit of clarity. A mid-chapter reveal arrived when the researcher cross-checked the compendium with the ledger he had glimpsed in Chapter 1. The ledger contained dates that matched disappearances from parish rolls. The compendium listed ritual instruments that required civic records. Birth registers, tax lists, marriage contracts. Someone had weaponized the town's paperwork to make erasure permanent. The researcher stopped breathing for a moment. This discovery altered the scale of the threat from local cultic violence to a coordinated administrative assault. "They didn't only want us gone," he said out loud. "They wanted to make it impossible for anyone to prove we existed." Joran slapped the table. "That's why we had to take it seriously." "Joran. That's why I brought the ledger." The researcher felt his suspicion shift again, this time toward clarity. The pattern had been administrative from the start. A network of permits, clerks, and masks. They planned a controlled exposure with the coastal magistrate-ass records to follow. The researcher drafted a list of demands to escalate. Identify clerks who issued seals, present compendium pages to regional officials, and secure asylum for Mara and Joran. He proposed a staged public reading of the compendium's key clauses, with the coastal guard as witness. The guards, who had seen no prior legal mandate like this, agreed to hold the compendium while the researcher delivered a formal statement. Before they could act, a twist. The courier's body failed at the table. He had hidden another document within his coat. A sealed petition naming several prominent patrons as supporters of the cult. When the researcher peeled open the seal, inside was a list of signatures, names of merchants, a minor judge, and the magistrate's assistant. The presence of patrons implied the cult had reached beyond the cliff and into the market and registry. The researcher felt the scale again widen. "We will present these names to the court," the researcher said. "We will show that the erasures had legal instruments and social backers. Mara stared at the petition and then at him. "If we do that, they will come for me," she said. "They will claim I destroyed their property or that I stole rituals." Her voice had gone small. The researcher thought of the leader's earlier claim that coercion enforced obedience. He thought of the rope around Mara's wrists in the ritual ring. He made a decision that would bind him to a moral cost. They moved at first light. The researcher walked with Mara and Joran to the coastal magistrate's hall, escorted by 2 guards who had agreed to act as intermediaries. The hall had long wooden benches and a steward's desk where clerks kept ledgers. The magistrate listened and did not open his mouth. He watched with his hands folded. When the researcher presented the compendium and the petition, the magistrate studied the handwriting and then called for a clerk. The clerk returned with a sealed file. He tapped a stamp on the document and revealed an official note. Several entries had been refiled under a different district's records last winter. The researcher read the dates and found their matches. The magistrate's face remained placid. "If these reassignments were lawful, we must follow procedure," he said. The researcher felt a sudden, sharp disbelief. This was the very mechanism the cult had used. The magistrate's calm read as institutional inertia. Mara whispered, "They will bury this again." The researcher met her eyes. He felt resolve harden. He, the magistrate, for an order to freeze those records pending investigation. The magistrate considered and then, after a long pause, signed a provisional hold. It was small but concrete. It gave the researcher a narrow window to publish his findings and to move Mara and Joran to safe houses. At noon, the researcher organized a controlled disclosure. He read selected clauses from the compendium into a clerk's ledger, and a guard recorded the reading verbatim. Several local witnesses testified that relatives once listed in public rolls had no trace after certain months. The magistrate's assistant objected loudly, but the hold remained. News spread through the market. People who had been told a relative died in another province found their names in the removed indexes. A murmur became an outcry. The researcher felt that clarity shift again into a cautious hope. That night, though, danger revisited. The magistrate's assistant in private warned the researcher that the patrons had means to influence judges outside the district and that the coastal guard alone could not secure protection. He slid a folded note across the table with a single line. "They will not let the ledger leave their network quietly." The researcher folded the note into his pocket and felt a cold anger. This was not just ritual zeal. This was power protecting itself. They split tasks. Joran would deliver copies of the compendium to a lawyer in the neighboring town known for exposing corrupt clerks. Mara would travel with a guard to a safe house. The researcher would escort the original compendium to a remote archive and record further testimony. Each choice involved visibility. Each choice increased risk. The mid-chapter mini cliffhanger arrived when, on the road to the archive, they discovered the coastal magistrate's seal broken on a ledger box at the guard station. The seal's wax had been scraped and replaced with a near-identical impression. A note pinned to the box read, "Processed for redistribution." The researcher opened the box and found blank pages where names should have been. A panic rose in Mara's chest. She grabbed the researcher's sleeve and hissed, "They moved faster than we thought." He felt the urgency tighten his jaw and, without words, they ran to the archive. At the archive they found more. A clerk's ledger with an entry in the assistant magistrate's hand. Dates matching those in the compendium and explicit directives to file certain names under an empty district. The researcher traced a line between signatures and the petition's patrons. This was proof of collaboration. He photographed the pages with a small camera and then watched the corridor because he expected footsteps. Footsteps came minutes later, fast, heavy, and 2 sets. A pair of masked men burst into the reading room, and the researcher lunged for the compendium. Joran tackled one of them. Mara knocked over a shelf to block the doorway. The researcher shoved the compendium into a hidden cavity in the reading table and jammed a loose board over it. They fought in blunt, physical ways. Grappling, throwing a stool, a hand clasping the researcher's collar. A shard of ceramic from a dropped oil lamp cut across the floor. Someone screamed. They escaped by the narrow back stair and spilled into the lane beyond the archive, breath steaming in cold air. One assailant had managed a cut along Mara's temple. They lost shoes, robes, and composure in a short, violent second. The researcher counted and found them all alive but shaken. They reached the safe house just as dusk turned the sea to ink. The researcher realized the compendium's concealment had been discovered only by chance that night. Their window had shrunk. In the safe room at dawn, with Mara's head wrapped and Joran pacing, the researcher laid out the remaining strategies. To publish selected sections in the market square with clerks present, to demand an external audit of district files, to send authenticated copies to a national advocate. Each option risked more than one life. The researcher felt the weight of choice and the moral architecture of his role. Expose and risk immediate harm, or conceal and allow systemic erasure to continue. His hesitation was no longer suspicion, but a practical calculation. They decided on a broadcast. The researcher arranged a public reading at the market's center at midday and ensured 2 bold witnesses, an independent tradesman and the lawyer, would verify the compendium's seals and attest to the forensic links. He prepared statements that translated ritual terms into administrative crimes, phrasing items as tampering with public records and conspiracy to erase identity. The language shifted the confrontation from theological to civic terrain. On the day of the reading, the market gathered in a cautious crowd. The researcher climbed a low platform and read in measured lines, citing dates and names. Joran released copies to the clerk, who then certified the hand. Mara stood at the researcher's side, hands bound by a bandage but steady. The magistrate's assistant appeared and, in the open square, denied any wrongdoing. A small scuffle began when a patron named in the petition shouted that his signature had been forged. An unexpected twist saved them. One of the patron's apprentices stepped forward and said his master had forced his signature under threat. He named the judge who had issued certain seals. The crowd murmured and a guard moved forward with a summons. The researcher felt the law's machinery begin to act. He watched Mara exhale hard and then look at him with a tiny, precise gratitude. Aftermath tightened like a net. Several patrons were questioned. The magistrate's assistant was suspended pending inquiry. The council leader vanished into the city's underways. Some initiates were arrested. Others fled. The evangel of erasure had not been fully dismantled, but its public face was broken. The researcher inventoried the outcomes and catalogued what remained unknown. The patrons still at large, the regional judges possibly compromised, and the broader ideological appeal of the cult's idea. In the small safe room where the chapter had opened and would now close, the researcher read the final pages of the compendium and recorded his notes. He reflected not on abstract lessons but on concrete consequences. Mara's cut would scar. Joran would be tainted by association. Parish records would need months of checks. He made a list of offices to notify and a list of people who must be offered witness protection. He sealed copies of the compendium in 3 separate trunks and hid the original beneath the floorboard beneath the table, where he had first arranged the fragments. He left a handwritten index note inside the safe room's latchet, for the clerk who believed truth must be visible. He wrote the note in a quick hand and signed it with a signet he did not normally use. Before dawn, Mara rose and pressed a damp palm to the researcher's forearm. "I owe you," she said. He shook his head and gave no grand reply. He had no illusions about redemption. He had only concrete tasks: to file affidavits, to prepare petitions, to keep records visible. He gathered his grimoire, adjusted his spectacles, and slipped the salvaged pages inside his coat. A knock came at the safe room door as he set the last trunk in place. It was deliberate and not the 3-rap code the guards used. He moved to the door and opened a narrow slit. A courier stood there, younger than the first, damp from a storm, holding a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. The packet bore the magistrate's new provisional stamp and a short line written in the assistant's hand. For the archives, keep this visible. The researcher felt the night's full arc collapse into this one beat. Legal proof in hand, an alias stamp, and the promise of continued vigilance. He opened the door and let the courier in.